Whitney Cruz had never intended to settle in a planned community, let alone one governed by a homeowners association. But after years of working in a high-pressure innovation lab, designing neural infrastructure systems for tech conglomerates and classified contractors, she needed quiet, not chaos. The sprawling property she purchased on the edge of the suburb wasn't picturesque in any traditional sense. The land sloped unevenly, the soil was stubborn, and an old greenhouse sat crumbling behind the house, devoured by ivy and time. And then there was the tractor. Rusted, sun-scorched, and thick with decades of grime, it leaned slightly to one side like a forgotten sentinel of a different era. Most would have called it junk. Whitney saw it differently. The tractor had belonged to the previous owner, a botanist who'd left the property to his niece and disappeared to Iceland, according to the real estate agent. It hadn't run in at least 10 years, and instead of removing it, Whitney had decided to restore it, or rather, reimagine it. She integrated strips of programmable LED lights into the frame, added proximity sensors to its base, and installed a modest solar panel that powered ambient lighting displays in the evenings. It wasn't meant to be functional in the traditional sense. It was a conversation piece, a protest in steel and circuitry against the HOA's insistence that beauty meant uniformity. To Whitney, it represented the essence of land that predated the rows of color-coded mailboxes and plastic lawn ornaments that had infected the surrounding development. At her modest housewarming gathering, an event that veered more into wine and code comparison than any neighborly potluck, a man with a name badge that simply read Trevor, Landscape Standards, wandered over to the back edge of her yard. He didn't introduce himself properly, just nodded toward the tractor, took a long sip from his reusable bottle of kombucha, and said, "That's technically equipment, you know. We usually ask owners to screen or store non-functional machinery." Then he smiled, not in friendliness but like someone flipping through the rulebook in his head. Whitney had smiled back, not out of kindness but amusement. She didn't owe anyone an explanation, not yet. The tractor sat entirely within her property line, posed no hazard, and wasn't violating any city ordinance. If the HOA wanted to challenge her on subjective, aesthetic principles, they'd have to do better than recycled policy language and passive-aggressive comments. Still, something in Trevor's tone lingered with her after the party had dispersed. It wasn't just disapproval, it was a warning dressed in politeness, an opening move masked as conversation. The days that followed were quiet, though her neighbor to the left, a retired anesthesiologist with 2 labradoodles and an obsession with synthetic turf, began spending more time walking the perimeter of his property. He never spoke to Whitney directly, but she often caught him pausing by the fence line, staring toward the greenhouse where the tractor stood illuminated each evening by the soft blue glow of its custom lighting array. Whitney found it oddly satisfying, even comical. Let them gawk. Let them wonder if the thing had cameras or motion alerts. In a world where surveillance was cheap and HOA boards treated homeowner privacy like a joke, she welcomed their unease. She spent the next week tuning the lighting software, writing new behavior scripts that made the tractor pulse like a heartbeat after dusk. It wasn't meant to provoke anyone, not exactly, but she'd never been one to conform quietly. The land was hers, the machine was hers, and if the HOA believed they could intimidate her into removing a personal project just because it didn't match the neighborhood's beige aesthetic, they were in for a surprise. She hadn't just moved here to rest. She'd moved here to reclaim space, and she had no intention of surrendering it without a fight. The first official sign that the association had chosen her as their next target arrived not as a knock on the door or a neighbor's complaint, but as a letter, tucked neatly into her mailbox, stamped with a seal that looked more ceremonial than legal. Whitney had been sifting through bills and a package slip when her eye caught the embossed HOA insignia, a minimalist tree inside a circle, the kind of branding meant to project community and order while masking the bureaucracy beneath. She opened it on the porch, expecting some routine notice about neighborhood tree trimming or a social barbecue she had no interest in attending, but the language was anything but casual. The letter accused her of violating Section 14 of the Community Guidelines by displaying industrial equipment in a way visible from the street, and it warned that failure to remediate the violation within 7 days would result in fines of up to $200 per week. She read the paragraph twice, feeling the absurdity press down on her. The tractor was not visible from the street unless someone craned their neck from a particular angle near the cul-de-sac entrance. Even then, it looked less like equipment and more like sculpture. The LEDs made sure of that. She set the letter on the kitchen counter, read it again under better light, and caught a detail she'd missed outside: an attached photograph. Grainy, taken from behind a hedge and clearly snapped through the slats of her neighbor's fence, the image showed the tractor mid-glow, blue and green lights tracing its rusted surface like veins. The fact that someone had gone out of their way to take that photo was more alarming than the violation itself. This wasn't random. It meant they were watching, waiting for the smallest opening. She stood by the counter for several minutes, debating whether to ignore it or respond, finally deciding on a measured letter of her own. Her response was calm, almost surgical in tone, citing municipal code definitions of agricultural versus industrial equipment, providing links to local statutes that excluded art installations and landscape integrated objects from regulation, and noting that her tractor had no motor, no fuel tank, and no capacity for function. It was an object, nothing more. She ended the letter with an invitation. If the board believed otherwise, they were free to commission an inspection at their expense, provided the inspector had the relevant state certifications. It was, in her mind, checkmate. She mailed it the next morning, feeling satisfied that logic would corner them into silence. The reply came faster than expected, just 4 days later, this time hand-delivered in an envelope slid under her front door. No stamp, no postmark, only her name written in a careful, almost calligraphic hand. The tone was clipped, colder, devoid of the pretense of community spirit. They rejected her argument outright, insisting the tractor had been abandoned equipment, and declaring that the board had exercised its right under emergency provisions to remove items deemed hazardous or unsightly. Whitney's eyes widened as she reached the last paragraph. According to the letter, the tractor was already gone, removed, reclaimed, integrated into a community improvement project. She bolted through the back door, heart hammering, half expecting the tractor to still be there, but the greenhouse sat hollow and silent, the ground flattened, a faint patch of raw soil marking where the machine had been dragged away. Not a scrap of metal remained. The solar panel had been ripped from its mount. The sensors, the wiring, even the soil around the tires had been leveled like someone had intentionally erased the footprint of her work. Whitney stood in the empty space, listening to the faint hum of cicadas in the evening air, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. They hadn't fined her. They hadn't waited for a court order. They had taken her property outright, without consent, without warning, as if her ownership meant nothing. That night she barely slept, replaying every possible explanation. Could the association even do that legally? Were they bold enough to cross from passive-aggressive fines into outright theft? She scrolled through the HOA bylaws on her tablet until her eyes ached, searching for any clause that could justify such a move. The only relevant line she found referred to removal of refuse or hazardous materials in cases of imminent danger to residents. There was no way a decommissioned, half-rusted tractor qualified as imminent danger, unless, she realized, they had rewritten definitions to suit themselves. The thought made her skin crawl. The following morning, Whitney drove the outer loop of the neighborhood, a route she normally avoided, scanning for signs of her machine. She almost missed it at first. At the far edge of the parkland, behind temporary fencing and stacks of lumber, a new pavilion was under construction. At its center, forming part of the foundation for a planned seating area, was something grotesquely familiar. The skeleton of the tractor, stripped and cut, welded into a framework, its wheels and hood serving as supports for freshly poured concrete. Even from a distance, she recognized the faint glow of her LEDs still wired to the body, blinking weakly as if mocking her. They hadn't hidden what they'd done. They had paraded it, turning her creation into raw material for their project, erasing its personal meaning and reducing it to nothing more than cheap reinforcement. Whitney parked nearby and approached the fence, gripping the chain links until the metal bit into her palms. Workers in neon vests moved back and forth, ignoring her presence, one of them even walking casually across the machine as if it were scrap steel. She wanted to shout, to climb over, to demand an explanation, but she stopped herself. Yelling wouldn't undo what she saw. This wasn't vandalism. This was premeditated. The tractor hadn't been discarded, it had been seized. The HOA had orchestrated it, right down to the forged narrative in their letter. When she returned home, she found another envelope waiting at her door as if timed to her absence. It contained an invoice, a fine for unauthorized modification of property prior to removal. They were charging her for the LEDs and sensors, labeling them as prohibited electronic modifications to community equipment. It was so brazen that she laughed, a dry, bitter laugh that turned into silence as the weight of it settled in. They had not only stolen her property but were billing her for the act of making it unique in the first place. That was the moment when the absurdity hardened into resolve. The HOA had drawn a line she could no longer treat as posturing. They hadn't simply challenged her design choices or aesthetics. They had invaded her home, manipulated language to justify their theft, and left her standing in the ruins of her own work. Whitney realized, staring at the fine print of the invoice, that she wasn't fighting for a tractor anymore. She was fighting for proof that ownership, autonomy, and integrity still meant something in a place designed to strip them away. And if they thought she would fold under paperwork and polite tyranny, they had chosen the wrong person to test. Whitney did not start with outrage but with a ledger, because numbers and paper trails behave better than people. So she cleared the dining table and laid out every receipt for the LED strips, the controller, the solar panel brackets, the stainless. Screws she had driven into the tractor's frame, then pulled bank statements that showed dates and vendors, and only when each item had a place did she draft a preservation notice that read like a scalpel. The association and its contractor were formally asked to retain all materials, correspondence, and meeting minutes related to the Community Improvement Project, and to cease any alteration of the tractor components now embedded at the park site until ownership was resolved. She printed 3 copies, sent one by certified mail to the HOA's office, one to the contractor's listed headquarters, and hand-carried the third to the site where a foreman with a sunburned neck listened politely, accepted the envelope with 2 fingers as if it were contagious, and told her in a voice trained to be neutral that he couldn't discuss materials sourced by the client and that all questions must go through the board, which was almost helpful in its coldness because it confirmed the chain of custody she needed to unravel. She filed a theft report at the police desk without theatrics, answering each question in full sentences while the clerk typed at a patient pace, and when the clerk slid the incident number across the counter as if passing a condiment, Whitney felt the small but undeniable relief that comes with any timestamp. Because now there was a moment in the record marking when the city acknowledged that property had moved from one state to another without consent. Back home, she wrote a second letter, this time an invoice, not as a dare, but as a mirror. Equipment utilization fee. For the period beginning the day the tractor vanished through the day of the letter, calculated at a modest daily rate that any rental yard would call conservative, with a line noting that the rate would continue to accrue until either the parts were returned or a settlement was reached. She copied the contractor's general liability carrier, whose address she found on the permit placard wired to the construction fence, and she copied the surety listed on the bond, because even private projects use insurance like oxygen and nothing focuses institutional attention quite like the word conversion. placed next to a policy number. The next morning brought a reply that pretended to be cordial and failed. A single-page notice from the board asserting that her abandoned apparatus had been reclaimed under a beautification initiative and that any claim to ownership was in dispute, which sounded impressive until she read the last line directing all further communication to a generic inbox that returned an automated response warning of a 10-business-day delay, and she understood the tactic. Stall, build the pavilion, pour the slab, let the fait accompli do the work that policy cannot. So she changed tempo and requested records under the state statute governing common interest communities. Not a threat, simply a list. The vote tally for the initiative, the minutes of the meeting where emergency removal was authorized, the procurement documents describing material sources, the indemnity clauses with the contractor, the emails containing the attached photograph of her yard, and any written definition used by the board for abandoned that differed from municipal code. She did not shout at neighbors or paste posters to lamp poles. Instead, she put a small placard on her back fence facing the greenway, a neat line of text stating that parts of a privately owned tractor had been removed without consent, and that no third party had been granted title. A sentence crafted less for drama than for the contractor's risk manager who would inevitably walk the site, read the words, and picture claim letters piling up like bricks. At dusk, she returned to the fence by the pavilion and watched the weak breath of her LEDs pulsing through the dust film. And because she had programmed their behavior herself, she could identify the sequence by feel, the slow fade to black after 8 seconds, followed by a 2-beat flutter. So she wrote the time down on a notepad and compared it to the controller's default schedule printed in her own documentation. And the fit was exact enough to satisfy even her harsher inner skeptic that this wasn't just steel and rumor, but her device, running the code she had authored, like a signature carved in light. The foreman, now more wary, told her again that these matters were above his grade, and asked her to step back from the fence for safety. And she did, not because he had authority over her, but because she needed him unalarmed and working, since a nervous contractor calls the client and a called client leaves fingerprints. Sure enough, the following day a different envelope arrived, this one from the contractor's insurer, politely acknowledging receipt of her notice and requesting any additional evidence of ownership, which she provided with the quiet satisfaction of a person sliding the final puzzle piece into a stubborn corner. Photos from the month she moved in, receipts with batch numbers, the template file for the LED sequence, whose metadata bore her name and the date stamp of its first compile. The HOA responded not with substance, but with speed bumps, issuing her a violation for the fence placard, unapproved signage, and a second for unpermitted alterations to landscape lighting visible from common areas, as if by ticketing the echo they could mute the original theft, and while she could taste the pettiness in her throat, she refused to let it drive the next sentence, so she appealed within the time frame required, citing the exact clause that permitted safety and legal notices without prior approval and attaching the incident number from the police report. And then she walked the perimeter of her yard and made a calm inventory of everything that remained hers and could still be taken, not in paranoia, but in prudence. The greenhouse shelves, the tool chest, the rain barrel, the spare aluminum tubing stacked beneath the eaves. She added a line to her invoice each week as the pavilion rose, and when she mailed the second statement, she included a copy to the surety with a single paragraph explaining that the owner had been placed on notice of a potential property claim and that any completion funds used to bury contested materials might complicate the bond's release. 2 days later, the contractor's project manager called. At last, his voice civil in the way of people who understand the gravity of paperwork, and he said they were reviewing options and that perhaps the board would consider replacing the embedded parts with like-for-like steel if she would agree to drop the matter. And she listened until he finished and then told him that replacement steel was not the point because provenance is not a bolt pattern, and if he wished to talk about resolution, he should bring a proposal that recognized ownership first and preferences second. That night, as sprinklers hissed along the park path and the pavilion sat under its skeletal roof, Whitney felt the conflict shift from a personal insult to a structural fault line, because now the contractor's insurer had filed a note, and the surety had circled a date on its calendar, and the board's habit of treating rules like elastic had run into institutions that count down in dollars rather than opinions. This was escalation without spectacle, a pressure building in hidden pipes, and it was exactly the terrain where she knew how to keep her footing. Whitney's weeks of careful documentation and precise letters had already begun to form a defensive wall around her, but the wall felt thin and brittle against the constant pressure from the association. She was fighting in the open with logic and evidence, while they fought with ambiguity, dragging their heels, issuing new violation notices, twisting language until it seemed to fold in on itself. What unsettled her most was not the bureaucratic aggression, but the growing realization that her case was not unique. One evening, while sifting through county permitting records, she noticed a peculiar pattern. Several homeowners in her district had voluntarily relinquished sheds, vehicles, or decorative structures that then appeared incorporated into community projects. The phrasing in the filings was eerily consistent, as if copied from a template, and in each case the timeline from violation notice to confiscation was absurdly short. To test her suspicion, she reached out to a woman whose name she found attached to a prior incident, a sculptor who had once maintained a large iron gazebo at the end of her lot. The woman answered cautiously, reluctant at first, but when Whitney explained her own situation, the hesitation cracked into relief. The sculptor admitted that her gazebo had been removed for safety reasons 2 years prior and then appeared 6 months later as part of a decorative archway in the HOA managed gardens. She had considered legal action but gave up after being buried in procedural delays and mounting fees. Whitney listened, taking notes, and when the woman finished with a bitter laugh, "They told me it was never mine, even though my name was welded to the frame," she felt both fury and clarity. Her tractor was not an anomaly. It was evidence of a systematic practice. The breakthrough came unexpectedly when she examined the pavilion more closely during one of her late evening walks. By then, the structure had grown, a skeletal canopy stretching over a plaza foundation, and in the concrete footings she saw not only her tractor's frame but also what appeared to be cut sections of wrought iron, curved pieces that looked suspiciously like the sculptor's lost gazebo. The implication landed heavily. The association was not discarding these items, it was cannibalizing private property, disguising appropriation as beautification. Whitney photographed every angle she could through the fence, careful not to attract attention, then returned home to catalog the images beside the records she had collected. Piece by piece, a mosaic emerged. Her tractor, the gazebo, and perhaps other elements hidden in plain sight, each one stripped from an individual under the cover of compliance. Armed with this, Whitney reached out to a friend who taught property law at the local university, someone she trusted to treat the matter with both rigor and confidentiality. They met at a quiet cafe, and over the low hum of conversation she laid out her findings, the photos, the invoices, the peculiar language of the notices. Her friend leafed through them with a frown deepening into something darker. At last, she tapped the edge of one of the letters. "This language, mobilization of environmental elements, is not standard legal phrasing. It looks manufactured, like they're hiding the absence of lawful authority under pseudo-technical terms." She explained that if the board had indeed fabricated consent through falsified notices or retroactive amendments, it crossed from bureaucratic overreach into fraud. For the first time, Whitney felt the current shift. She was not merely on defense anymore. She had material that suggested deliberate misconduct. But with revelation came escalation. That same week, her email was breached. She discovered it late one night when her two-factor authentication logs showed a successful login from an unfamiliar IP address routed through a neighboring state. At first, she panicked, rushing to change credentials, but then she noticed something more chilling. Only one folder had been accessed, the one where she stored correspondence and draft claims against the HOA. Nothing else was touched. It wasn't a random hack, it was targeted, meant to remind her that she was not safe even in digital space. She printed every notification, added them to her evidence folder, and forced herself to steady her breathing. Fear was exactly the lever they hoped to use against her, and she refused to hand them that advantage. The real turning point arrived when she received a plain envelope, no return address, slid under her door much like the earlier notice. Inside was a single sheet of paper, photocopied, containing fragments of what looked like board meeting notes. One line was underlined. Proceed with integration. Crews will fold if isolated. Whitney stared at the sentence for a long time, unsure whether it was authentic, a warning from someone inside, or a psychological trick planted to destabilize her. But the handwriting in the margin, faint but visible, didn't match the secretary's neat official style. It was hurried, almost furtive. Whether it was genuine or not, it told her one thing. Somebody within their circle was uneasy enough to slip information her way. That unease meant cracks, and cracks could be widened. Whitney no longer thought in terms of saving a tractor or even proving ownership. She was confronting an ecosystem designed to absorb, repurpose, and erase individual rights under the guise of neighborhood harmony. Standing by the pavilion fence, watching workers weld beams into place with her machine's frame as the invisible skeleton, she whispered to herself words that steadied her. If they make me invisible, I'll make them transparent. This was not a declaration of war, but of exposure. The midpoint of her struggle was not retreat, but the recognition that the fight had shifted from personal insult to systemic unveiling. For the first time, she felt that her battle, though solitary, had the potential to fracture something much larger than her yard's boundaries. Whitney had always believed escalation would come in the form of paperwork, perhaps another violation notice or procedural trick, but what unfolded next was something closer to a campaign, designed to box her in from every angle until resistance itself looked like folly. The first sign came in the mail as usual, a thick packet labeled Community Enforcement Action, inside which she found not one violation but 6, each citing a different supposed infraction: unapproved lighting visible from the street, unauthorized, signage, improper waste storage, failure to maintain landscaping, obstruction of common access, and even potential hazard to pedestrian view, corridors, a phrase so absurd it almost made her laugh. The fines, neatly totaled at the bottom, ran into thousands of dollars, and the closing paragraph warned that unresolved amounts could result in lien placement. She read it twice without blinking, then placed it calmly on her desk beside her growing archive of evidence. The escalation was not about rules, but about attrition, overwhelming her with the sense that each step forward birthed 2 more walls to climb. Her friend in property law confirmed her suspicion. The cluster of violations filed simultaneously was an intimidation strategy, meant to trigger despair rather than compliance. They want you to negotiate from exhaustion, she explained. But Whitney did not exhaust easily. She filed each appeal separately, each one citing its clause, each one mailed by certified post, forcing the board to answer line by line. What unsettled her more than the letters, however, was the subtle shift in atmosphere among her neighbors. The woman who once greeted her during morning walks now averted her eyes. The retired couple across the street, once chatty, closed their garage the moment she stepped outside. One evening, she overheard fragments of a conversation as she passed a cul-de-sac gathering. Non-cooperative, risk to cohesion, makes everything harder for the rest of us. It was clear the board had begun sowing narratives, painting her not as a victim of appropriation, but as the architect of discord, someone whose stubbornness burdened the community. Then came the construction noise. Early one morning, she awoke to the grind of machinery and looked outside to see workers staking orange flags into the strip of land that edged her property, a buffer that by all records belonged to her parcel. When she confronted the crew leader, he waved a laminated permit and claimed the area was designated for a pathway extension to improve communal walkability. She demanded to see the boundaries marked, and his discomfort was obvious. The paperwork bore signatures of the HOA's architectural committee, but the survey map looked like a copy several generations removed, its lines blurred and altered. She documented everything, taking careful photographs, and when she later overlaid the supposed pathway line onto the county's digital parcel map, the result was undeniable. The path cut straight across her boundary by at least 10 feet. The message was clear. Not content with stealing her tractor, they now sought to encroach directly on her land, as though physical presence could erode her claim more efficiently than any bylaw. That evening, as if timed for maximal pressure, a neighbor she barely knew knocked on her door with a polite but strained smile. He explained that several of them were concerned about ongoing disputes, and wondered if she might consider stepping back from her complaints for the sake of harmony. When she asked what harmony meant to him, he faltered and said only that the board had reassured them the improvements would raise everyone's property values and that her resistance was complicating matters. She thanked him for his candor and closed the door, but the encounter left her uneasy, not because of his words but because of the glimpse of calculation behind them. She was being isolated deliberately, painted as unreasonable until silence from her side seemed the only socially acceptable option. Her resolve hardened when the contractor's insurer, previously responsive, suddenly went quiet. Weeks passed without acknowledgement of her evidence, and then an unexpected letter arrived stating her claim could not be processed because the HOA had asserted ownership of the tractor at the time of integration. Enclosed was a declaration, notarized, dated retroactively to before the removal, which claimed she had been notified of the abandonment. The declaration bore her signature, except it wasn't hers. It was a forgery, competent but not perfect, the loops of the letters off by just enough to sting her professional pride. Rage churned through her but quickly cooled into focus. This was escalation of a different order, not intimidation, but fabrication, the creation of false history to overwrite her own. She scanned the document, filed it with the rest, and called her law friend, who upon seeing it muttered only, "That's criminal if you can prove it." Proof became her obsession. She began tracing the flow of decisions, cross-referencing meeting dates with county filing logs, hunting for inconsistencies. It was during this trawl that she stumbled upon the breakthrough. In the minutes of a board session, buried between motions about landscaping and recycling, was a resolution referencing community salvage initiatives. The text described a pilot program allowing the board to reallocate neglected assets for public projects, provided notices were issued. But the county clerk's timestamp showed the resolution filed 2 weeks after her tractor had already been cut apart and embedded in the pavilion. They had legalized the theft after the fact. The resolution itself was a retroactive shield. Armed with this, Whitney drafted her most pointed letter yet, addressed not only to the board but to the county compliance office and the state's Consumer Protection Bureau. She laid out the sequence, the forged declaration, the retroactive resolution, the evidence of repurposed property from multiple owners. She was not asking any more. She was declaring the existence of a pattern and demanding investigation. Dropping the thick packet into the mail slot late that night, she felt a calm clarity settle over her, the calm that comes not from victory but from stepping onto firmer ground. The escalation was unmistakable now. The HOA had shifted from pressure to manipulation, from social isolation to outright forgery, and each move betrayed a growing desperation. For Whitney, it was both terrifying and galvanizing. She knew retaliation would intensify, that they would find new ways to make her presence unbearable, but she also knew she had forced them onto a path where their lies left a paper trail too jagged to erase. The board could isolate her from neighbors, smear her as obstinate, even attempt to bleed her dry with fines, but they had already made their critical mistake. They had left evidence in their own handwriting, and she intended to make that handwriting visible to anyone willing to look. The summons arrived not from the HOA but from the county courthouse. A notice that a preliminary hearing had been scheduled regarding Whitney's complaints and the association's counterclaims of noncompliance. She had expected resistance, but what unsettled her was the speed. It was as if the board itself had pressed for the hearing, confident that procedure would favor their side. On the morning of the session, she walked into the wood-paneled courtroom with a thick binder pressed to her chest, its spine already swollen with months of letters, notices, photographs, and annotations. Across the aisle sat 3 board members accompanied by counsel, their posture relaxed, the kind of confidence born from years of winning by attrition. Yet when the judge, a woman with a reputation for cutting through theatrics, asked for opening statements, Whitney felt a flicker of advantage. She was not here to argue in abstractions, but to present what the board feared most, a chronology they could not fully control. She spoke carefully, beginning not with outrage but with a narrative of sequence, laying out how the tractor had been stationary, integrated into her property, how it had been removed without notice, how the pavilion now carried its skeleton. Then she moved to the documentation, sliding exhibits across the clerk's desk, photographs of the LEDs pulsing in the concrete, the letters of violation dated after removal, the resolution filed weeks late. The judge listened, expression unreadable, but Whitney noticed her pen slow when the forged signature entered the record. She explained how the declaration bore her name, yet not her hand, how its date predated the county's stamp, and how that contradiction proved intentional fabrication. The room shifted subtly at that word, fabrication, a ripple of unease even among the opposing counsel. The board's attorney attempted to counter with arguments about community standards and the discretionary authority granted under the bylaws, emphasizing that abandoned property created hazards and that the pavilion represented a communal benefit. But Whitney seized the weakness. If the tractor had been abandoned, why had it been retroactively categorized as salvage only after incorporation? If it had been hazardous, why was it repurposed structurally into a public site? She pressed the logic until it snapped, forcing their counsel to retreat to vaguer language about board discretion. The judge finally interjected, asking directly why the resolution's filing date post-dated the removal. The answer, an administrative backlog, sounded thin even as it was spoken. Then Whitney revealed her final piece. The anonymous photocopy of board notes slipped under her door, the line about integration, and her supposed willingness to fold. She admitted the source was uncertain, but placed it alongside the other evidence as context, and for the first time saw the board members shift in their chairs, the veneer of confidence cracking. The judge did not treat the page as proof, but as atmosphere, and atmosphere mattered. It framed the rest of their actions not as bureaucratic error, but as deliberate coordination. When the session broke, Whitney stepped outside into the cool stone corridor, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the release of the weeks of taut resolve. She knew nothing was final yet. The hearing was only the first step, but in that room, under oath, the association's tactics had been dragged into light. The judge concluded with an instruction that all further alterations to the pavilion halt until ownership issues were clarified and referred the matter to the district attorney for review of potential document forgery. That last phrase reverberated in Whitney's mind, document forgery, because it was no longer her accusation alone, but a judicial acknowledgement that something criminal might be embedded in the HOA's paperwork. As she walked down the courthouse steps, binder still clutched tight, she saw one of the board members lingering by the curb, phone pressed to his ear, face pale beneath the afternoon sun. For the first time, she sensed they had lost the script, that their habit of controlling narratives with silence and delay had been disrupted. Whatever came next, the fight had tipped. She was no longer merely defending what was hers, but standing in a space where their confidence collapsed under the weight of their own manufactured history. Weeks after the hearing, the pavilion remained fenced off, its construction frozen in a strange half-life, the skeleton of steel and embedded machinery locked beneath tarps while the county review unfolded. Whitney no longer walked past it with clenched fists. Instead, she noted the absence of activity as a quiet confirmation that the momentum had shifted. The board issued no further fines. Neighbors ceased their pointed silences, and the flood of notices that had once arrived weekly dwindled to nothing. It was not victory in the absolute sense. Her tractor was still ruined, her evenings still haunted by the sense of intrusion. But there was a space now, a pause in which she could breathe. The district attorney's office requested formal interviews about the documents and the retroactive resolution, and though the investigation moved slowly, the mere fact of its existence had changed the calculus. The board could no longer act with impunity while under scrutiny. Whitney poured her energy into rebuilding, not the tractor itself, which was beyond recovery, but a representation of what had been taken. She commissioned a local fabricator to cast a hollow concrete replica in the exact dimensions of the machine, polished and luminous, its body etched with patterns that resembled code. She installed it on the edge of her yard where it faced the street, not as defiance but as permanence, an unmovable marker that required no approval because it was categorized as art. Neighbors paused to stare, and over time some approached quietly to ask about it, their questions tentative but sincere, and in those exchanges Whitney felt a reversal of the isolation the board had tried to impose. They saw not an obstructionist, but someone who had endured a campaign of erasure and responded by making absence visible. The real closure did not come with a verdict or restitution, which might still take years, but with the realization that she had shifted the balance of perception. The HOA could continue to issue statements about compliance, but the record of forgery, the halted construction, the replica tractor standing like a monument in plain sight, these spoke louder. She understood now that ownership was not only about legal title but about the refusal to be rewritten, the insistence that memory resist the machinery of bureaucracy. As autumn settled and the lights embedded in her sculpture pulsed gently in the evening air, Whitney felt no triumph, only steadiness. What had begun as a fight for a single object had become proof that even in the most curated, controlled environments, there is room for resistance, and resistance, once visible, is difficult to erase.